And through Menachem, I met Ben Ferencz, who is a book in himself. He was the youngest prosecutor at Nuremberg. He was 27. You could live beside somebody. They could be your friends, they could be your neighbors, they could be your relatives. And given the right circumstances, who knows what would happen to any of us. And this was a doctor, like a physician, who absolutely hated Armenians. And one of the things that he did was to nail horseshoes into the feet of his victims and make them walk through the town. I suppose start at the beginning. I'm originally from Canada. I was born in Montreal, grew up in Toronto, and then wanted to be a journalist through a stroke of serendipity, became one, and then moved to London, which was the center of English-speaking journalism anyway. And my career took off from there. I started on Fleet Street. My first real job was at the Daily Mail. And then I think my first article was on Pancake Tuesday. So it shifted a bit. And more recently, I went to Iraq. I went 4 times to cover the invasion. And then I ended up in Afghanistan, where I lived for a year and a half and just loved it. And, there were so many stories both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And sometimes, you don't know what you're going to write about, but in those places, the stories just seemed to fall from the sky. Everything was a story. So it was fantastic. Yeah, I think the book was really an accident, but I have always been interested in foreign news and in human rights. And I remember when I was working at a newspaper in London, and at the end of the day, you'd filed your copy, you were waiting for the edits to come back, and I would always be sitting cross-legged on my chair reading the foreign news, and inevitably the editor would come by. He'd be looking down, and all of a sudden, you'd look up and you think, oh no. And so I always wanted to cover it. And then when I was about 12, I went to Dachau, a German concentration camp, with my parents. And I think that was really, for me, actually I was about 9, a huge eye-opener. And I don't think anything has ever shocked me to the core like that. So that was part of it. Also, my father was a psychiatrist, and I think that also informed a lot of how I looked at life. He's very empathetic, very smart, and, he dealt with humanity, obviously. When I was in Toronto, just before the pandemic in 2020, I went to see my father and met a woman called Paulette Volgese, and she was the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she had moved to Toronto in 1950 and was now teaching Yazidi survivors of ISIS who had moved to Canada how to speak English and how to navigate life in their new country. And what I found amazing about Paulette was that she was born in Bergen-Belsen, another concentration camp, after the war. And that opened up a whole sort of new path. And I met Professor Menachem Rosensaft, who was also born in Bergen-Belsen, whose mother was, she was a dentist doctor who helped kids there. She was another inmate. And it was amazing because we went to Bergen-Belsen together and saw the cinema where Marlene Dietrich's sister used to work, and of course all the memorials. And through Menachem, I met Ben Ferencz, who is a book in himself. He was the youngest prosecutor at Nuremberg. He was 27. He had arrived in the States when he was 10 months old, and as he said, he had a great sense of humor. And as he said, he was lucky to survive the journey because he cried so much his father wanted to throw him overboard. But his uncle saved him, he says. He didn't learn to speak English till he was 8. He spoke Yiddish. They were very poor, grew up in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. And basically a guidance counselor, student counselor, told him he had 2 choices. He could either join a gang or he could become a lawyer. And he said he didn't know what a lawyer did, so he checked it out. And of course, he decided he wanted to be a lawyer and did whatever he had to do. And of course, he was so brilliant, Harvard gave him a scholarship. And he ended up, as a soldier in the war, and then as a prosecutor at Nuremberg. So, I mean, he was 101 when I spoke to him. He died at 103 2 years later. And it was just extraordinary because it was that real link to history. I mean, Nuremberg was incredible. So, and of course, today, when I started writing the book, genocide was kind of like a dusty old topic. And now, of course, it's, right up there on everyone's list. I sort of think a lot of my life, and I'm sure other people's, is about serendipity. I mean, something, I became a journalist because I went to see a friend of my mother's who was an editor. I went to see her about something totally different. She asked me if I would write an article, and I did, and that was it. I mean, I knew I had found my absolute passion. And, I've, as I said, always been interested in human rights and things. And then when I was in Toronto and met this woman who was head of a project called Project Abraham, who helped resettle Yazidis. And I said, well, do you want to do an oral history? And that sort of opened the Pandora's box. And I think basically everything has led to it because, my work as a journalist, around the world and my interests. So it was serendipity in a way, even though I don't totally believe in serendipity, but it was a nice loop. I think for one very good reason we still have them, and I think until we learn the lessons, we will continue to have them. What I found interesting in writing about the genocide of Rwanda, of the Armenian genocide, Holocaust, they all had such similarities. The othering of people, the dehumanization, the same sort of terminology. You're a vermin, you're a cockroach, you're a rat, whatever, your nose is bigger, whatever it was. There were such parallels. And, people's motivations and, of course, human nature. But it's always amazed me how you think you could live beside somebody. They could be your friends, they could be your neighbors, they could be your relatives. And given the right circumstances, who knows what would happen to any of us. And I found that shocking and fascinating. And I think, we look at what's going on in, Gaza and Israel. Whether it's a genocide or not is, I suppose, yet to be decided, but certainly you think in 2025 this should not be happening. I mean, the only real route is peace. And, two people have to learn to live together. So I think that's it. I think we need to learn the lessons, and when you look at it, it's just horrific. I find it frightening. I just cannot believe that we are living in a world where we are seeing the rise of fascism, whether it's in Hungary or in the US. And I would say that there are people in the Israeli cabinet who are fascists, not all of them. And the hatred of the other, I find it incredible. Like America, we always looked at the states, they were liberal, they had abortion, they had all sorts of other sort of liberal policies. And now everything is being rolled back. It's terrible. I mean, one of the things that differentiates Canada to the States is, we have socialized medicine, which I think is both a British person and a Canadian person, you think is fundamental. And as in Canada and the UK, we don't have capital punishment, which I think is also fundamental. So it is shocking, and carrying weapons and things that are just alien to our cultures. But of course, I know lots of fabulous Americans, and you feel very sorry for them to have to live in this, under this administration, because Trump's only out for himself and his family and getting as much money as possible and whatever, we'll see. Hopefully it's not going to be as bad. But I think it's a very frightening time. I think the world hasn't been in this bad a shape for many generations. So there were so many. And I think one of the things that I found very fascinating was the women I encountered. And I've written an article recently about the effect of three women. One was Anne Frank, who we all know about, who, died when she was, I think, 13 at Bergen-Belsen, weeks before the end of the war with her sister, and how the publishing of her diary just galvanized a whole, I don't know about school of thought, but, everyone read it. And, whatever it is, 80 years on, it's still, so relevant. And then during the Armenian Genocide of 1915, there was a woman called Aurora Mardiganian, and she had seen her mother killed, I think her aunts killed. She was on, a death march. She was sold as a slave. I mean, completely barbaric, and some say a blueprint for what the Nazis did. But she ended up in the States, and she became a huge international sensation. They made a movie about her and what was going on in Armenia, which was what she wanted to do to, make sure everyone knew. I think it was called Ravished Armenia. She raised a huge amount of money on that and helped bring this into public consciousness, although it was there because there was an American ambassador called Henry Morgenthau Jr. I think I have to check that. And the New York Times wrote dozens and dozens and dozens of articles, but, America wasn't in the war and didn't want to go in the war. But her story just brought home to the world what was going on there, as did, Anne Frank. And then the Yazidis, their story was told by Nadia Murad, many other people, of course, but who won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. So I thought those were interesting. And then there was also a small group in Nazi Germany called White Rose, and Sophie Scholl was one of the founders of it. And they were a peaceful resistance anti-Nazi group that handed out leaflets and wrote sort of anti-Nazi slogans. And she and her brother and the other members, I think, were all executed, her by guillotine. One of the things that I found very interesting was I met through a friend many years ago a woman called Sandy Feiner. And Sandy Feiner's mother was called Fania Landau, and she was born and grew up in Białystok in Poland. The Nazis had, turned it into a ghetto, and she managed to get a pass from a colleague of her father's, ostensibly to go and clean the villa of a Nazi in a nearby spa town. But really her mission was to find her brother a hiding space. And so she had taken off the Jewish stars and she had hidden a bit of jewelry on her in case she needed to bribe somebody. But shortly after she left the ghetto, a little 9-year-old Polish boy yelled, "Jew." The Nazis arrested her. And she had sort of laughed it off and said, no, I'm not Jewish. And she made the sign of a cross, and there was a priest nearby, and she said, what's happening in Białystok? And he said, it's on fire and the Jews are frying. She ended up going to a concentration camp, and then in 1943 was sent to Auschwitz, where she met a woman called Zlatka Pitlock, and they became best friends. And for Fania's 20th birthday, Zlatka decided that they needed to celebrate. Zlatka said in one of her testimonies, we didn't know if we would be alive tomorrow, but we were alive today and we were going to celebrate. And so she managed to get some rations from all the other women who worked at the munitions table together, where they were stuffing gunpowder and bullets for the Nazis, which they sort of hijacked, putting dirt in on occasion, and made her a little cake with bread and some butter for icing and a bit of marmalade. And then she decided she wanted to make her a souvenir. So all the women, she commandeered the women to find bits of paper and cloth and whatever they could. And she made a heart-shaped origami heart, which I think all 19 women signed. And it's about palm size, and it's got a purple cover with a big F on it, which, despite beatings and other torments, she managed to keep in Auschwitz, hiding it in a bunk bed on the floor in the dirt and on the death march, which both women went on. And in 1988, she donated it to the Montreal Holocaust Museum, where it is now the centerpiece. So that's another story of women and resistance and resilience, mainly resistance that, what they said was the Nazi, Fania said, I wanted to show that we had our humanity, and that people made me a present. And it was pretty remarkable. I remember speaking to a Turkish professor who sort of discovered the whole sort of Armenian genocide in his hometown of Gaziantep. I was talking to him and he said, have you come across Dr. Rashid yet? And I said, no. And he said, just wait. And this was a doctor, like a physician, who absolutely hated Armenians. And one of the things that he did was to nail horseshoes into the feet of his victims and make them walk through the town. It was just astonishing. And I have to say, like read all of these genocides are hideous. And I think there is really a limit. I ended up watching a lot of rom-coms. Just thought, okay, because it's terrible and it haunts you. I've read lots of things. I've written the occasional thing. I've read psychological report, whatever. I can answer the question, but I don't understand it emotionally because it's not something I could ever imagine wanting to do, or I just think it's horrendous. And when they were opening the prisons in Syria, there was a photograph of this man who was just crouched, and somebody, I think, said, "What's your name?" And he just didn't move. He didn't answer. And, and that feeling is, I just want to hug him and take him home and tell him everything will be okay. So I don't know how people spend their lives torturing people or how you can hate someone so much. Because, of course, like most people, I enjoy other people's differences and, and traveling and learning about other cultures and being in other cultures. And so I don't know if you can reconcile it. I mentioned that I had interviewed Ben Ferencz. And Ben Ferencz was sent to do the research on the Einsatzgruppen, and so those were the, mobile death squads. And he said after counting to 1 million victims, he stopped. He, a lot of them were convicted, but what he said, and his message never changed, was never give up. And I think even though they're pretty dark times and it's pretty hard sometimes to be optimistic, I think we don't have a choice. We have to keep going and keep trying until it doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I don't know what the other option is. So keep learning about it and writing about it. When I first started my book and somebody asked me what I was writing about, and I said, starting a book on genocide. And she said, I'm not interested in genocide because I'm not Jewish. And it was like, well, you don't have to be Jewish. You could be Rwandan or Armenian, or because the Armenian community, as all of them, but still feels it so much today, 120 odd years after. I interviewed a Rwandan survivor, and he just said, I can talk so much, but I can't talk about the rest. It's not clear in my head yet. And of course, it took a long time for a lot of Holocaust survivors to talk about it for various different reasons, and other trauma victims, yeah. I interviewed a couple of people from Rwanda. I interviewed a few Yazidi women. I was back in London, I think, when I spoke to a young woman, Yazidi survivor, who I think wanted to tell her story. And we had, through an interviewer, a nice sort of preliminary chat. And then she said, when I start telling you my story, I'm going to turn the video off. And then she just wept through the whole thing, and of course you just sort of say, you stop when you want. You don't tell me whatever you don't want to tell me. If this is good for you and helps, get it out of your system and tell the story, continue. And she did. I mean, my friend Sandy's mother, I don't think ever spoke or didn't speak much about it until much later on. But then Professor Menachem Rosensaft, his parents, who were both at Belsen and Auschwitz and very involved, did talk about it. And in fact, his mother gave testimony in one of the trials shortly after. I don't think it was Nuremberg, but shortly after the war ended. My name is Heidi Kingstone. I just done a wonderful interview with Byline TV, and you can buy my book called Genocide, Personal Stories, Big Questions on Amazon.